Nestled in the southwestern waters of the Korean peninsula is the beautiful Jeju Island, South Korea's largest island and a renowned tourist hotspot, often called the Hawaii of the East. With its breathtaking scenery and unique cultural heritage, Jeju Island draws visitors from all over the country. In the northwest of South Korea, in Gyeonggi Province, lies Incheon, the country's third-largest city. Located 40 kilometers west of Seoul, Incheon is a vital port city, with its northwest harbor serving as a key trade port for South Korea. With state-of-the-art facilities, Incheon is a crucial hub for maritime transport. In the southern part of Incheon, in the city of Ansan, there's a public school called Danwon High School. In 2014, 325 second-year students from Danwon High School were gearing up for a 4-day school trip. Their plan was to depart from Incheon port and take a cruise to Jeju Island. At that time, a large cruise ship, previously known as the Namanoe from the Japanese company Oshima Shipping Company, was docked at Incheon port. This ship had been in service for 18 years without any issues. Later, the ship was purchased by the South Korean company Chonghaejin Marine Company, and its president, Yoo Byung-eun, personally renamed it the Sewol, symbolizing a vision to surpass the wings of the city. Clearly, President Yoo Byung-eun had high expectations for it. The old ship underwent extensive renovations under his supervision, expanding the cabins on the original 5-deck structure. The first and second decks were cargo holds, the third and fourth decks were passenger cabins, and the fifth deck housed the bridge and crew quarters. Yoo Byung-eun, an avid photographer, even had an art gallery at the bow of the ship displaying his works on the renovated Sewol. The ship measured 146.61 meters in length, 22.2 meters in width, and 14 meters in height, with a displacement of 6,825 tons. It could carry 960 passengers and transport 987 tons of cargo, making it the largest of its kind among South Korean cargo vessels. 1 year after the incident, the Sewol was officially put into operation, specializing in routes between Incheon port and Jeju Island, with 3 trips per week. The schedule was meticulously planned, typically departing from Incheon port at 6:30 p.m. and arriving at Jeju Island at 8 a.m. the following morning. Passengers could enjoy a good night's sleep on board without delaying their plans for the next day. In the spring of 2014, over 300 second-year students from Danwon High School boarded buses, heading to Incheon port to catch the cruise, filled with anticipation for the trip. However, they could never have imagined that a century-defining disaster was about to befall them. On Tuesday, April 15, 2014, in the evening, the students from Danwon High School arrived early at Incheon port. They lined up, pushing their various-sized suitcases, ready to board the ship. They were about to embark on the cruise ship, Ohamina. Unfortunately, the weather took a turn for the worse. Just before departure, a thick fog rolled into the port, reducing visibility on the sea to less than a kilometer. For safety reasons, the Port Authority issued a warning and temporarily halted all nighttime departures, grounding 10 ships docked at the port. The students passed the time chatting and gazing out at the fog-covered sea, hoping it would soon lift. After waiting for several hours, it was now 8:30 p.m. The fog gradually dispersed, and the weather began to improve. However, the Ohamina still showed no signs of departing, which made the anxious students start whispering among themselves. A sense of unease began to spread. That evening, among the scheduled departures was a large ferry named Sewol, a sister ship to the Ohamina, owned by the same company and similar in size and structure. Due to its significant cargo, the Sewol urgently needed to head to Jeju Island. After re-evaluating the weather conditions, the Port Authority lifted the restrictions, making the Sewol the only ferry permitted to depart that night. At this point, over 100 passengers had already boarded the Sewol, but there were still plenty of empty cabins, enough to accommodate the students and teachers from Danwon High School. To avoid disrupting the next day's travel plans, the school decided, after consulting with the captain, to switch from the Ohamina to the Sewol for their trip to Jeju Island. Upon hearing the good news, the students cheered and eagerly called or texted their parents about the change. Over 300 students, with their colorful suitcases, excitedly boarded the Sewol one by one. For most of the students, it was their first time on such a large ferry. They curiously looked around, with some playful students lightly tapping on the railings, finding it amusing. The atmosphere was filled with laughter and chatter. Guided by the crew, the students made their way to the fourth floor. This floor was specially reserved for the Dan1 high school students, while the teachers stayed on the fifth floor with the crew, and other passengers were assigned to the third floor. The students lined up and entered the fourth floor cabins. The corridor seemed endless, with cabins neatly arranged on both sides. Opening a cabin door revealed portholes offering views of the sea. The bunk beds resembled those in a student dormitory, with 8 beds per cabin, arranged in bunks on either side of the door. Though the passageways were somewhat narrow, the rooms were tidy, with no unnecessary furnishings. The students were very pleased with everything. They quickly unpacked, some lying on their bunks, others looking out at the sea through the portholes. Meanwhile, the Sewol's crew was busy with final preparations for departure. In contrast to the lively atmosphere in the cabins, the port was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of the Sewol's engines and the sound of waves breaking the silence. Despite a thin layer of fog still lingering on the sea, the ship was granted permission to depart. The anchor was slowly raised, and everything was set for departure. At 9 p.m., with the sound of the ship's horn, the Sewol Ferry slowly departed from Incheon Port, setting course for Jeju Island. As the coastline gradually disappeared, the students' excitement grew. The demanding Korean education system made their daily studies extremely rigorous, so this school trip was a rare opportunity to unwind. They eagerly anticipated the freedom of the sea breeze and the beautiful scenery of Jeju Island. After leaving the port, some students gathered on the deck to enjoy the night breeze, feeling utterly content. Others roamed the ship with friends, snapping photos to capture the memories. Some stayed in their cabins, snacking and chatting, while others turned off the lights and listened to ghost stories in bed. The central hall on the third floor was bustling with activity, where 2 Filipino singers were performing live, filling the hall with wonderful melodies. Everyone raised their glasses to celebrate the successful departure. At 10 p.m., all passengers were invited to the deck for a spectacular fireworks show. As brilliant lights shot into the night sky, fireworks exploded in the darkness, illuminating the night and lifting the students' spirits. The next day happened to be a teacher's birthday, so the students stayed up until midnight to celebrate. As soon as the clock struck 12, they eagerly brought out a cake and celebrated with their teacher, capturing the happy moments in photos. In the pitch-black night, the Sewol Ferry was the only light. Gradually, everyone fell asleep. By 8:30 the next morning, the students began to wake up one by one. Some headed to the central hall on the third floor for breakfast. At this point, the Sewol Ferry was still sailing smoothly, having entered the Mongol Strait, an area known for its strong underwater currents located between Jindo and Mongol Island. The sea was calm, and most of the journey was already completed. Barring any unforeseen events, the ship was expected to reach Jeju Island in 2 hours. However, disaster struck unexpectedly at 8:48 a.m. The students in the cabins suddenly felt a violent jolt. On the deck, stacks of cargo containers were thrown into the water with loud thuds, and the splashing water fiercely hit the ship's hull. What was more alarming was that even after several seconds of shaking, the ship did not regain its balance. The entire vessel tilted 30 degrees to the left. In the central hall on the third floor, passengers having breakfast fell over like dominoes. Inside the cabins, passengers and their belongings were tossed to one side, making it nearly impossible to stand. The corridors were filled with fallen passengers, many of whom were injured. Second-year student Choi Deokha from Dan1 High School was in the fourth-floor corridor when the sudden jolt threw him to the ground. Realizing the severity of the situation, he called 119 at 8:52 a.m. For minutes after the incident. Usually calm under pressure, Choi's voice trembled and his pitch rose as he struggled to convey the ship's dire condition to the operator. Fearing he hadn't been clear, Choi handed the phone to a nearby teacher. Unfortunately, the teacher was even more panicked and could only cry for help, failing to provide useful information. The phone was returned to Choi, and after the operator grasped the situation, the call was transferred to the Mokpo Coast Guard. Mokpo, a port city in Jeollanam-do, South Korea, had jurisdiction over the incident. Mistaking Choi for a crew member, the Coast Guard operator asked for the ship's coordinates and other technical details. Choi, confused, did his best to describe the situation, emphasizing that there were over 300 students on board and urgently requesting assistance. Remarkably, Choi Diakha was the first person on the Sewol Ferry to send out a distress signal, even before the crew. As Choi made the call, the ship's broadcast began to play. This message repeated for at least an hour after the incident, playing at least a dozen times. At 8:55 a.m., 3 minutes after Choi's call, First Officer Kang Won-jik sent a distress signal to the Jeju Vessel Traffic Service, asking them to notify the Coast Guard for rescue. After several attempts, they finally contacted the Mokpo Coast Guard at 8:59 a.m. By then, the Coast Guard had already received Choi's call and dispatched a patrol boat. The broadcast's instruction to stay put helped calm them a bit. With the teacher's reassurance, the students' panic slowly subsided, and they obediently stayed in place, hoping the ship would stabilize soon. The atmosphere in the cabin was tense and unsettling as the ship remained tilted. Suddenly, someone laughed, breaking the eerie silence. The students began to joke lightly and encourage each other, trying to maintain a positive attitude while waiting for rescue. 19 minutes after the incident, at 9:07 a.m., the Jeju Vessel Traffic Service, closer to the Sewol Ferry, received another distress call from First Officer Kang Won-jik. Until 9:38 a.m., the Jeju Vessel Traffic Service stayed in contact with Kang, urging the crew to instruct all passengers to put on life jackets and prepare for evacuation. 25 minutes after the accident, at 9:13 a.m., the Sewol Ferry's tilt not only persisted but worsened, surpassing 50 degrees. Despite this, rescue efforts had yet to arrive. It was baffling that the onboard broadcast continued to instruct everyone to stay put, specifically advising the students and teachers from Danwon High School to remain calm and avoid any rash movements. There were no further instructions. The cabin atmosphere was tense and eerie, filled with a profound sense of fear. With their teacher's help, the students put on their life jackets. The corridor was now so slanted that standing upright was impossible. The students were almost sitting against the walls, growing increasingly terrified. At 9:18 a.m., half an hour after the accident, a student spotted a red ferry through a porthole, igniting a spark of hope among everyone. As the rescue ship approached, the news spread through communication groups, and some people couldn't help but cry tears of joy. This red ferry, the Dula Ace, was the closest ship to the accident site and had received the distress call from the Jindo Vessel Traffic Service, VTS. It immediately sailed at full speed to the scene, becoming the first ship to arrive that day. However, the floating cargo from the Sewol obstructed its approach. The captain of the Dula Ace did his best to get close and provided life jackets and lifeboats, but no one from the Sewol had yet organized an evacuation, and the vast deck remained empty. 5 minutes later, the Dula Ace reported the situation to the Jindo VTS, which continued to urge the Sewol crew to evacuate the passengers. However, First Mate Kang Won-jun claimed that the broadcast equipment had malfunctioned and that there were too many passengers to evacuate safely. Despite multiple reassurances from the Jindo VTS, the crew still did not organize an evacuation and continued to tell passengers to stay in their cabins. 2 minutes later, the Jindo VTS again pressed Captain Lee Jun-suk of the Sewol to decide on an evacuation, but Lee did not respond, only repeating the ship's status updates. During this time, the communications officer repeatedly broadcasted instructions for passengers to remain still. The sky was overcast with dark clouds, creating an ominous atmosphere that made every second feel interminable. From 9:32 a.m. onwards, various civilian vessels began arriving at the scene to assist with the rescue efforts. Under the unified directives of the Jindo Vessel Traffic Service Center, the arriving ships deployed lifeboats to assist the passengers. The 123 patrol boat from the Mokpo Coast Guard and the B-512 helicopter also reached the scene but did not establish direct contact with the Sewol Ferry, nor did anyone attempt to enter the cabins. The passengers on the Sewol Ferry received no actionable instructions and were too frightened to move. The entire rescue process appeared chaotic, with no effective coordination among the rescuers, leaving everyone uncertain about what to do. Some ships simply circled around the Sewol, unable to initiate the rescue. Helplessly, everyone watched as the large ferry continued to tilt. By 9:35 a.m., 47 minutes after the ferry began tilting, there was still no water ingress into the passenger cabins. With so many ships nearby, an organized evacuation could have saved lives. But that didn't happen. As time passed, the fear among the Danwon High School students intensified. Suddenly, the situation took a dramatic turn for the worse. Water burst through the third deck, flooding the hallways and cabins. The Sewol continued to list to the left, reaching a 62-degree angle. Cries and wails echoed through the hallways, and 2 teachers were swept away by the water. Facing death, the students were on the verge of emotional collapse, some incoherently calling out for their parents. Parents, informed of their children's plight through messages, dropped everything and rushed to the shore, praying for their safe return. Amid the roaring waters, the broadcast still instructed everyone to stay put. No one entered the cabins to rescue the passengers. Some realized they couldn't just sit and wait for death and began to flee in panic. At this point, the Sewol's tilt accelerated, with the top deck nearing the water's surface. By 9:37 a.m., Captain Lee Jun-suk made his final report on the ferry's tilt to the Jindo Vessel Traffic Service Center, after which all communication with the Sewol ceased. At that moment, 3 Coast Guards navigated a small rubber boat around the cargo containers, trying to get closer to the Sewol. 10 minutes later, the rubber boat successfully reached the ferry's deck. By 9:48 a.m., they rescued their first group of distressed individuals, who turned out to be 8 crew members, including Captain Lee Jun-suk, rather than passengers. By 9:54 a.m., the Sewol's portside bow was completely submerged, but most students continued to follow the broadcast's instructions, waiting for rescue. A few rebellious students, still able to move, groped their way along the corridors. With the help of a kind passenger, several students used fire hoses to climb to the deck, awaiting helicopter rescue. By 10:03 a.m., the Sewol had tilted over 70 degrees. Some students were trapped in the central hall on the third deck, where water violently battered the glass and poured in. Adults, students, and young children were all there. With the ferry tilted, the hall's floor was almost vertical to the sea. In this situation, only by grabbing fire hoses and climbing 20 meters could they be saved. Some passengers mustered all their strength to escape upwards, aided by a few kind-hearted individuals. Some managed to escape, but others, weakened by exhaustion, could not be rescued. Soon, seawater flooded the hull, engulfing many. At the time of the incident, Inspector Park Sung-ki was patrolling waters 40 kilometers away, cracking down on illegal fishing vessels. Upon hearing about the Sewol Ferry accident, he immediately changed course, steering the Jeollanam-do 201 Fisheries Patrol boat at full speed toward the site. By 10:04 a.m., he arrived at the scene. By then, 76 minutes had passed since the incident began. The sight that greeted Park Sung-ki was shocking. The Sewol Ferry was nearly capsized, with 2 helicopters hovering above and about 20 ships surrounding it, all motionless and not participating in the rescue. Without hesitation, Park steered his boat directly toward the Sewol Ferry. Noticing a large number of passengers awaiting rescue, he risked his life to board the ferry and, together with his colleagues, successfully saved 28 people. The flashing warning lights on his Jeollanam-do 201 Fisheries Patrol boat prompted the nearby civilian ships, thinking it was a government rescue vessel, to approach and begin rescue operations. In the next 15 minutes, these civilian ships rescued 120 people, playing a crucial role in the rescue efforts. By 10:15 a.m., some passengers had reached the deck. At this point, the Sewol Ferry was tilted over 90 degrees and on the verge of capsizing, making the situation extremely perilous. These passengers bravely jumped into the freezing sea and were rescued, but none felt the joy of survival. Cold and terrified, they lacked even the strength to cry until they reached the shore, where they finally broke down in tears. 2 minutes later, the situation worsened rapidly. By 10:17 a.m., the Sewol Ferry passed the vertical tipping point and completely capsized, with only its right side remaining above the water. The students inside finally realized they could no longer follow the broadcast instructions. Desperately calling for help, the boy was dangerously close to the sinking Sewol Ferry and could be pulled back into the sea at any moment. Risking his life, Park Sung-ki steered his boat towards him at full speed and managed to rescue him within minutes. This boy was Park Jun-hyuk, a second-year student from Danwon High School. When the ferry capsized, Park Jun-hyuk was still inside, struggling to escape while holding onto a girl. They fought against the rushing water, but with the ship upside down, they couldn't find their way out. As the water level rose, Park decided to make a desperate attempt to survive. The two took a deep breath and dived underwater, but the currents created by the sinking ship separated them. After several seconds of underwater struggle, Park Jun-hyuk managed to escape and surfaced, while the girl vanished into the dark sea. 58 minutes after the capsizing at 11:18 a.m., the ship was almost entirely submerged, with only a blue spherical part of the bow visible above water. Following the accident, various departments organized emergency operations. However, despite the involvement of numerous agencies, there was no unified command, leading to overlapping responsibilities and a lack of accurate information, resulting in a chaotic rescue effort. On the morning of the incident, when passengers began their frantic attempts to escape at around 10 a.m., South Korean President Park Geun-hye had already been briefed about the accident, but then went missing. At 11 a.m., with the Sewol Ferry almost entirely submerged, the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters reported to the Blue House that there were no casualties. Subsequently, at 11:01 a.m., the Munhwa Broadcasting Corporation broadcasted this news, followed by other media outlets. The false report of no casualties lasted for 49 minutes. Some parents, hearing that all the children had been rescued, were overjoyed and tried to contact their children, only to receive no response. The previous farewell messages from their children kept flashing on their screens, piercing their hearts. Soon they realized something was wrong. As the misinformation was debunked, public opinion quickly turned negative. The Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters admitted they were unaware of the actual situation on the ship. Meanwhile, the rescue efforts remained disorganized. At 12:04 p.m., the Navy's salvage unit arrived at the accident site but, lacking diving equipment, could only stand by around the Sewol. At 1:42 p.m., the Marine Police's deep-sea diving special rescue team finally arrived, but the tidal conditions prevented any rescue operations. It wasn't until 5:15 p.m. that President Park Geun-hye made an appearance. She was completely unaware that hundreds of students were trapped on the ship and was shocked by the lack of progress in the rescue efforts. Upon arriving at the Ministry of Security and Public Administration building in Seoul, she even asked, "I heard the students were all wearing life jackets, so why is it so hard to find them?" Clearly, she had not grasped the severity of the situation. At 6 p.m., the first underwater rescue operation began, involving only 4 divers, 2 Coast Guards, and 2 Navy personnel. The operation lasted 10 minutes and did not result in any rescues. However, the government falsely claimed that 118 Coast Guards and 42 Navy personnel were deployed. When this lie was exposed, it sparked public outrage. At 10:20 p.m., the underwater rescue operation resumed. This time, they recovered the body of a crew member and a high school student who still had a faint pulse. Unfortunately, the student passed away shortly after arriving at the hospital. That night, the families of the missing were sleepless. In the early hours, Prime Minister Chung Hong-won moved the families to a gymnasium in Jindo and gathered reporters to address them, planning to leave quietly. Enraged, the families surrounded him, causing chaos. the Coast Guard announced they would begin nighttime operations, injecting air into the compartments to increase the chances of survival for any passengers. Distrusting the authorities, the families rushed to Jindo Port to witness the rescue efforts firsthand. Throughout the night, the Coast Guard controlled the site, prohibiting anyone from approaching the underwater rescue. Official statements claimed that over 500 divers were involved in the rescue efforts. However, some parents saw no divers around the Sewol Ferry. Media reports stated that 14 bodies were found that day. 2 days after the incident, the entire ship sank. By then, more and more civilian divers couldn't sit still and applied to join the rescue. However, they were all blocked by the Coast Guard, unable to even get their boats in. The authorities and media continued to release false news and then retract it, with no substantial progress in the search and rescue after 3 days. Adding to the frustration, the captain of the Sewol and some crew members, fearing for their own lives, abandoned the passengers and fled, leaving the parents filled with anger, disappointment, and a deep sense of helplessness. It wasn't until April 19th that the rescue efforts formally began, with the Coast Guard, Navy, and civilian divers all participating. At 4 a.m., the staff set up 3 guide ropes to assist civilian divers in the search. An hour and a half later, divers reached the seabed, where the massive Sewol lay silently, the interior eerily still, a sight that was heart-wrenching. Families in the gymnasium watched the live underwater search, unable to hold back their tears. That evening, they spontaneously gathered on a fishing boat and sailed to the site where the Sewol sank. The sea was empty, and the parents wept uncontrollably, mourning their lost children. A total of 49 bodies were recovered that day. The search continued until November 11th. After 209 days, the search was declared over, with only 172 out of the 476 people on board rescued. The remaining 304 were all dead or missing, including Choi Diakha, the Danwon High School student who was the first to call for help. This disaster became the worst maritime tragedy in South Korea's history. In 2015, a year after the incident, the South Korean government contracted the Shanghai Salvage Company to fully recover the Sewol Ferry, initially estimating the cost at 91.6 billion Korean won. However, the operation proved far more challenging than anticipated, with actual costs soaring to 280 billion won. After overcoming numerous difficulties and a 2-year preparation period, the Shanghai Salvage Company officially began the recovery operation between March and April 2017. The crane ship Genhua 30 successfully lifted the Sewol Ferry out of the water and transported it to Mokpo New Port. After 1,091 days underwater, the Sewol Ferry finally saw daylight again. Following the disaster, authorities launched an investigation into the cause of the accident. It was discovered that key AIS data was lost at the time of the incident, leading to various theories about the cause. The most widely accepted theory is that of cargo overloading. According to an official investigation report, cargo overloading was the direct cause of the Sewol Ferry's sinking. The ferry's hull became unstable due to a sudden right turn, causing the overloaded cargo to fall into the sea, which disrupted the balance and caused the ferry to tilt to the left. Crew member Park Han-ju instructed helmsman Cho Jun-ki to switch from the automatic steering system to manual at 8:48 a.m. to change course. At that moment, the hull suddenly lost balance, and the bow began an uncontrollable right turn. Cho attempted to steer left, but it was futile as the bow turned more sharply to the right, causing the ferry to tilt left. The falling cargo containers exacerbated the tilt. By 8:53 a.m., the Sewol Ferry had veered 20 degrees to the right, drifting in a bizarre J-shaped trajectory on the sea. The maximum load capacity of the Sewol Ferry was 987 tons, but on the day of the incident, it carried 182 cars, 3 large heavy trucks, 3 steel water tanks, and a large amount of steel bars, totaling 2,143 tons of cargo, more than twice its maximum capacity. Furthermore, to accommodate the excess cargo, the crew illegally pumped out a significant amount of ballast water. Ballast water is stored in ballast tanks to increase the vessel's weight, adjust its center of gravity, and maintain stability. Insufficient ballast water can lead to inadequate balance adjustment when the hull tilts. On that day, the Sewol Ferry carried only 760 tons of ballast water, far below the required standard of 1,703 tons. To accommodate more passengers, the ferry's third to fifth deck cabins were expanded, raising the center of gravity by 51 centimeters, making the vessel more prone to capsizing. During navigation, the sudden loss of control over the steering gear led to an excessive turning angle, resulting in the tragedy. Many maritime experts have also confirmed the possibility of mechanical failure. Among the surviving crew members of the Sewol, helmsman Oh Young-suk wrote a personal confession, stating that the structure of the Sewol was poorly constructed. The bulkheads in the second-floor cargo hold could not prevent water from entering, which would only speed up the sinking once water breached the hull. Theory 2. Deliberate anchoring. This theory, suggested in the documentary In the Absence, posits that if the ship turned right, it should have tilted to the right. However, the Sewol tilted to the left, leading to speculation that some force was pulling the ship to the left from the front left side. The documentary pointed out that, based on available footage, both anchors of the Sewol were black before departure, but after the incident, the left anchor had lost its paint and showed signs of rusting. This suggested that the left anchor had been deliberately dropped into the water, causing the ship to make a sudden turn. This theory posits that the sinking of the Sewol was a conspiracy by the crew. Some crew members allegedly aimed to sink the ship by secretly dropping the anchor during navigation, leading to the disaster. However, the Sewol Investigation Committee stated that both anchors were properly retracted and secured, with no signs of being lowered. Simulation experiments by the Dutch Maritime Institute also showed that even if the anchor were dropped, it would not be enough to cause the sinking. Theory 3. External impact. This theory once gained widespread traction among the public. Based on disclosed track maps and radar images, some experts pointed out that at the time of the incident, there was a massive object behind the Sewol, much larger than a container capable of changing direction on its own. This theory suggests that the erratic trajectory of the Sewol was due to a collision with a submarine. Additionally, surviving passengers confirmed hearing a mysterious loud noise at the time of the incident, pointing towards this theory. However, when the ship was salvaged, the British company Brooks Bell's investigation found no significant collision marks on the Sewol's hull. While a subsequent investigation report did not entirely rule out the theory of external impact, it concluded that the likelihood of such an occurrence was very low. If the disaster was caused by cargo overloading, ship modifications, and sudden turns, the actions of the captain, crew, and relevant authorities after the incident were even more chilling. The question of why they did not rescue the passengers became a major concern for the public. Ultimately, human error was the fundamental reason for the tragic loss of over 300 passengers. Initially, the captain and crew received clear instructions to organize the passengers to put on life jackets and evacuate immediately. At that time, the ship's tilt angle was not severe, and timely evacuation could have significantly reduced casualties. However, the captain and crew of the Sewol abandoned the passengers, prioritizing their own escape. Despite receiving instructions, the crew still told passengers to stay put while they themselves boarded lifeboats. At the time of the incident, Captain Lee Jun-suk was resting in his cabin. When he heard the commotion, he climbed to the top deck and was rescued while wearing only a long-sleeved shirt and shorts. First Mate Kong Won-sik refused to comply with the Jindo Vessel Traffic Service's evacuation orders, claiming that there were too many passengers to evacuate. In reality, the Sewol was equipped with 44 small lifeboats, each capable of holding 25 people, and 4 marine evacuation systems, each accommodating 250 people. These facilities could collectively evacuate 2,100 people. If the rescue had been well organized, everyone could have been saved. However, only 2 lifeboats were used during the incident. When Captain Lee Jun-suk was rescued, he was only wearing a long-sleeved shirt and shorts. Despite being the person most familiar with the Sewol Ferry situation, he did not assist the rescuers after safely evacuating, failing to fulfill his responsibilities. These facilities could accommodate a total of 2,100 people. At the time, there were 476 people on board the Sewol, so if the rescue had been properly organized, everyone could have been saved. The Vessel Traffic Service Center repeatedly emphasized that if passengers jumped into the water, nearby ships could ensure their rescue. However, the passengers did not receive these instructions and only heard repeated broadcasts telling them to stay put. Choi Tae-min's death anniversary falls on March 21st, while the Sewol Ferry sank on March 17th, just a few days apart. This has led some to believe that the over 300 victims on the Sewol were intended as sacrificial offerings by Choi Soon-sil, leveraging her close relationship with President Park Geun-hye for her father Choi Tae-min's resurrection. There are rumors that Park Geun-hye was aware of the impending disaster and that the 7 hours she was unaccounted for were spent performing rituals for Choi Tae-min. The Sewol Ferry's owning company, Chonghaejin Marine Company, was led by Yoo Byung-eun, who had close ties to another religious group, the Evangelical Baptist Church, which was recognized as a cult by the Korean Presbyterian Church in 1992. This group, founded by Yoo's mentor, had many of the company's crew members as followers. The group was also involved in the infamous Five Oceans incident in 1987, which resulted in 32 deaths. Furthermore, the name Sewol, given by Yoo Byung-eun, carries religious significance. The original captain of the Sewol had repeatedly reported issues with the ship's stability before the incident, but the company dismissed him. Instead, they appointed Lee Jun-suk as the acting captain for this voyage, leading to public speculation that the disaster was a conspiracy orchestrated by Yoo Byung-eun. After the incident, Yoo was wanted for embezzlement and other charges. The police deployed 6,000 officers to capture him. 2 months after the Sewol disaster, in June 2014, Korean police announced that Yoo's decomposed body had been found in a field in Suncheon, Jeollanam-do. The body was too decomposed to determine the cause of death, but dental records and DNA confirmed it was Yoo Byung-eun. His mysterious death only added to the eerie and enigmatic nature of the entire incident. After the Sewol was salvaged, many animal remains were found inside, further fueling these beliefs. Tragically, these 3 crew members lost their lives while attempting to save the passengers. Following the final verdict, 53 individuals were found guilty, including crew members, personnel from the Korea Coast Guard, and those from Chonghaejin Marine Company. The survivors from Danwon High School faced immense psychological trauma after the disaster. Over time, they returned to school, but many struggled to move on, often haunted by dreams of that tragic day. Walking through familiar spots on campus, they would see the images of their lost classmates. In January 2016, nearly 2 years after the accident, Danwon High School held a special graduation ceremony. Desks were adorned with flowers and photographs to honor the vibrant lives that were lost. The surviving students took their classmates' photos and returned to Jeju Island. On that sunny day, they took pictures on the beautiful island, bringing a sense of closure to their unfinished school trip. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel.